Buenos dias, Gunners Collective TV. Back at it, you already know. Like a torta with some bad habits. Bye, bye. Let's get straight to this intro. Welcome back to the channel. If you haven't already hit that like and subscribe button, make sure you go ahead and do that. Put your notification bell on all so that way you're directed in the direction of the dope content that I stay kicking. And I appreciate the support, man. I'm very humbled by it. So why the Norte will never be the same without the F14ERS, the Bulldogs, right? But prior to being the Bulldogs, they were called the F14ERS, the Fresno Norteños, right? And you know, it's kind of like having the craziest homeboy in your neighborhood, right? The hitter, the shooter, you know, we all got it. The craziest homeboy that you don't even fucking want to be around him, right? But you just know if something pops off, he's the first one hanging out the window. You know, he's busting your eardrum because he's blowing shit up. That's the homie right there that everybody needs and everybody wants, but they could do without just for, I mean, hey, that's my old lady. Don't do it in front of her, right? That type of homeboy. Well, that's what the F14ERS were to the Norteño cause. They were the crazy group. They were the group always in the mix, getting off. They had numbers. And the F14ERS were bred as Norteños to, and conditioned as Norteños to function in a productive manner for the Norte cause, right? And they did all that. They were involved in a lot of the historical events, you know, with the Norteños being probably one of the biggest cars besides San Jose and Salas. You know, the F14ERS were always present at every institution, at every yard. You know, there was a lot of F14ERS. So the Fresno Norteños were definitely, you know, spoken highly of and very well respected. But just like in any other group, when you notice that they start to distance themselves, there's going to be a problem, Houston, right? And the problem was this. The F14ERS, given that name, F14ERS already distinguished themselves as something different from every other Norteño. See, every other Norteño was just a northerner from a different city, whether it's Merced, Modesto, Tulare County, San Jose, Salas. There was no S14ERS or M14ERS or none of that. It was just Norteños. But Fresno has always been the type of group to choose to distinguish themselves from the rest. Okay. And that came with arrogance. That came with a knowing that they were a little bit, they felt they were not knowing, but thinking that they were a cut above the rest. Because to be given that name F14ERS meant they were Fresno Norteños. And what was the difference between a regular Norteño and a Fresno Norteño? It was all supposed to be the same, right? But Fresno chose to give themselves a title and be different from the rest. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say they weren't some of the hardest hitters that ever came out of the Norte, because they most definitely were, right? But at the same time, that was the first inkling of truth right there. That was the first, you know, that was the first clue that Fresno was going to break away at some point in time, because they were already giving themselves their own title. They weren't just Northerners. They were Fresno Northerners, right? When the break happened, when the F14ERS decided to go Bulldog and to break away from the Norte cause, right? Yes, it hurt the Norteños tragically. Like I said, it's like having the craziest homeboy in the neighborhood suddenly pass or decide that he's going to flip to another gang or doesn't want to rock with you anymore. That's a big L for you. And not only is it a big L, but you know he's a super hitter. So you know he poses a potential threat to you because you already know his DNA and what he's made up of, right? And that's what it was with Fresno. When the Fresno boys decided to defect from the Norteño cause, not drop out. Let me get that out the way right now. They are not considered dropouts, and I'll explain to you why. But because there's a lot of people that run around, oh, the Bulldogs dropped out of the Norte, their whole group is founded on dropouts. That's not the case. And it's a slim line, but I'll explain it to you. So, like I said, like losing a crazy homeboy, that's what it was for the Norteño cause to lose the F14ERS. It was a big L because numbers dramatically dropped. They were a car that was a standalone car, meaning that they had the numbers to stand alone in some instances. And when they immediately defected from the Norteño movement, they became enemies. It wasn't like they left and said, hey, we don't want no problems. We're just going to do our own thing. It was anybody can get it. So much so that there was points in times in the beginning when they actually were working hand in hand with the Sureños, right? There was no alliance there, never was, but there was a red light placed on the Bulldogs that when they went to Sureño yards, they weren't to be touched and they were going to be allowed to establish to some point. What happened with that was the Sureños noticed that a lot of Norteños that would hit that yard would get off immediately on the Bulldogs or vice versa. And they felt the Bulldogs weren't up to par with what they thought they should be. And so with that being said, slowly but surely, the Sureños decided to push them away and didn't like the fact that these guys were still rocking F14ers, because there was a time, maybe a few years, when the F14ers continued to get F14 blasted on them. And when asked by Sureños why they were still getting big old 14s blasted on them if they didn't represent the Norte, they were told by the Bulldogs that the F14ers belonged to them, that it meant something different, right? I was told even with the Bulldogs, there's I believe a certain amount of number of teeth in the mouth of the Bulldogs, and they were like, it's 14 and this and that. And I was told that, they were always going to be considered F14ers. They just weren't rocking under the Norteño flag anymore. Now, like I said, when you take an L like that, when a group decides to defect, that's like Los Angeles saying they're not going to be Sureños anymore, the whole city. Okay, I know Los Angeles is much bigger than Fresno, but Fresno is a pretty big city in the Central Valley in Northern California, right? And it was always considered Northern California before the split. As soon as it became the split, then they started representing Central. That's why they were called Fresnal, right? Central meaning that they were Central boys. They weren't representing North or South. They were against the grain and at it with everybody. And, I got to commend and respect the Bulldogs. They've carried their torch to this day. The F14ers died out. That group died out within the Bulldog movement. I'd say a couple years ago, there's still older veteranos running around, OGs with F14s blasted on them that still remember the old ways and respect the old ways. But this new class, this new era, they are against the 14 period, right? So they don't represent F14ers, but they respect the old school F14ers, the Bulldogs. When the Bulldogs decided the F14ers to do their own thing, the Norteños immediately declared war upon them, and vice versa. The F14ers declared war upon the Norteños too. And I was a part of the fabric of that war. I remember in the youth authority with the day it happened, I'll never forget being given that Wila to read. And it was a respectful Wila. It wasn't disrespectful. It wasn't saying, hey, you guys ain't up to par. You guys are poop butts. It was none of that. It was, this is what's being handed down from prison due to prison politics. This is what it's going to be. And regardless of the relationships we have as friends, as homeboys, as camaradas, as any of that, we're going to go ahead and step back. And that was a big loss for us. So I could tell you in the small scheme of things, how it affected us, because when I was in Fred C. Nellis in the youth authority, you hit a compound, there's maybe 5 Norteños from Hayward, Merced, Modesto, San Jose, whatever, right? And there'd be 5 or 6 Bulldogs or F14ers, right? So that was half our manpower. So when they decided to step back, it was like leaving 3 or 4 of us alone. That was the truth. So, and then not only were we being told that they were going to step back, we were now told that we were considered the enemigos, right? And so we had no choice but to declare our flag and get off with them. And it was, a hard hill to climb, because not only did we have the Southsiders standing back ready to jump at any show of weakness, now we had people that looked just like us that used to represent not even 3 days before what we represented, now telling us fuck what we claim. Okay? That it was never going to be again the same. And it never has been. Now, let me explain to you guys. Will the Norte ever be the same? In any group, they recover. They accumulate numbers. They gain traction. They start to go in a different direction. With the F14 loss, no, the Norteño cause will never be the same, because, like I said, Fresno is one of the bigger cities up north, especially in the Central Valley. And that 20,000 manpower. To lose that in the prison system and even on the streets is a big fucking deal. It's something you can never recover from. It's something not a lot of groups have had to withstand. That's why I respect the shit out of the Norteños, because withstanding that, and even the Bulldogs the same, withstanding, the adversary. And, the Bulldogs, which are the F14ERS, right? They are now what the F14ERS were, are very resilient when it comes to what they do. Okay, because imagine being enemies with everybody, but still holding it down. And I understand you don't see a lot of Bulldogs outside of Fresno County, outside their city, but back in them days when the split first happened, there was a lot of the F14ERS that were indoctrinating people from San Jose, from Merced, from Madera, from Modesto into becoming Bulldogs. And there was a lot of guys that flipped and joined the Bulldogs just because they had that relationship with them and they knew that they were a strong group. And I can't deny it, man. When I was locked up with those dogs, those F14ERS, they were solid, and they shot me a wheel and was like, hey, bro, you're from the Central Valley. You're from down the street, the 209. At that time, Fresno was 209. You need to come into the stronghold. You need to come into the fold. And I remember contemplating, what direction to take at that point in time. Was I going to continue to represent, my city and the Norteño movement, or was I going to join this group of friends that had backed me up and had saved my life on numerous occasions, right? And it's hard. It's hard when you're young to make that type of decision, but ultimately I decided to declare war against the F14ERS and the Bulldogs and to stand with the Huelga Bird and the Norteño cause, because that's what I was taught, and I didn't believe in going jumping ship, right? Not to say that those who did were punks or anything, absolutely not, but that just was my personal preference and choice. Now, I knew from that point on the Norteño movement would never be the same, because it was never the same after that whatsoever. Any time from that point on, someone from Fresno came in, and believe me, in the beginning, there was a lot of Fresno Norteños that decided they weren't going to go Bulldog. They were going to continue to represent the Norte. And there was a lot, especially from Chandler boys from the West Side, WFN, Fresno Norteños, North Side, that decided that, hey, we're not going to be Bulldogs. This is what we are. This is what we started out as. They're kind of the same mentality as me, and this is what it's going to be. Now, what made it different was you couldn't trust them. Even if it was a solid homeboy that really had your back, you could not trust them, because anyone who was from Fresno was subject to switch up on you at any point in time. And a lot of them did. I told you guys a story a long time ago when I first created my channel about Smilon from Fresno. He was a homeboy. He was representing the Norte. He was beating on Bulldogs, beating them up every day. And the one particular Bulldog named Shy Boy from Selma, I believe, Sanger or Selma, he pulls up, and he pulls up to the same compa where Smilon's at, and he gets in his ear tough, and was able to flip him. And I didn't know. And here I am every day. I would walk the track and wait for the homeboy Smiley so we can go to school area. He was a big old boy, right? Knocking everything down. And that was kind of like my henchman. Like if I had him with me, could no one see us, right? And I'm waiting. He's not. And I look back and he's with that dude Shy Boy, that Bulldog. Used to wear some sunglasses. Thought he was all tough, all big and shit. And I noticed they're walking together. The homeboy looks different. The homeboy used to have bald head, whatever. Now he got the little hair slicked back. You could just tell, arrogant. He had the little glasses. And I hit him up. What's up, Smiley? He's like, I'm a Bulldog. And I was like, wow, right? At that point in time, it was kind of, there was Bulldogs functioning, Southsiders and Northerners. It was Carl Holton, right? And it wasn't wartime. Everybody was just like, whatever. That was an elbow we took. So it was never the same, because anytime a homeboy came from Fresno, he always had to be questioned. He always had to be SB'd on, security blank. You always had to look at him a certain way. And because you didn't know if he was playing the role, if he was going to get off, if he was really sympathetic to the Bulldogs or whatever. And that hurt. That hurt because you couldn't trust a homeboy that you're supposed to have full faith and trust in, right? As far as the Norteño movement, man, a lot of people like to believe it's watered down, or, when the Bulldogs left, it became weaker. I'm not going to say it became weaker, but it became more of an obstacle while incarcerated with less numbers. Okay. The Fresno boys out there in Fresno, they're vicious. They're with the business, man. Those that sleep on the Bulldogs and talk shit about them, you got to understand, man, the Bulldogs are a different breed. They have been against everyone since day one, right? So, and I'm talking about this new era. So for them to go at it with everyone, it's nothing to them. That's what they've been doing. They make that choice when they lace up their shoes and lock their muzzle. That's just how that is. As far as the F14er breed, now that was a whole different type of animal. The F14ers were not only did they have that Fresno street mentality, that gangbanging mentality, but they were also super norteños, meaning that they had there were strongholds of the prison organization within their city. They had a deep, rich history of having OG homeboys, F14ers that were part of that. So it was like a mentality that they had to live up to a certain standard, right? The F14ers. And like I said, I have a primo who's an F14er, right? To this day. And he chose to stay an F14er and a Norteño rather than go Bulldog. He had the option, just like any other Fresno boy did. But the way he was laced and where his heart was with the Norteños. Now, those F14ers that still rock that way, and there are a few Norteños OGs that are still doing that, they're very well respected in the game by Norteños because they were willing to make a hard decision. You know, no other gang can tell you, you know, that they defected from another gang or another group and were able to sustain like the F14ers, like the Bulldogs, right? So no, the Norteño movement will never be the same. They'll never be the same because they're probably the only group that lost the biggest group of manpower at one time. Also, they created, or a new enemy was created for them. So it made it even harder, you know, because at that time you had a lot of Fresno F14 Norteños that were locked up in the Fresno County Jail. And the Bulldogs took them to war immediately. You know, they decided we're not going to rock that anymore. That's not going to be us. So there was a lot of that going on. You know, there was always a bitterness and a rivalry between San Jose Norteños, Sanjo, and F14ers, Fresno. And that was just, and it wasn't because of the city life and the famero. It wasn't because of any of that. It was more so, I mean, in YA it was, but in prison and in life in general, it was more so due to animosity towards one bigger city and the other, right? San Jose had always been the representation of the Norteños in the Bay, South Bay, the whole Bay area, whereas Fresno was the biggest group of Norteños in the Central Valley. And there's never been a rivalry between the Central Valley and the Bay. You know, it's two different stilos, two different swags, always been like that, but it's never been a bit of rivalry. You know, I always got embraced every time I went to the Bay Area by other Norteños. It was always love when I was active, and vice versa, right? Where it was a beef was between the city of San Jose and the city of Fresno. And not everyone rocked that beef, but those that were incarcerated know what I'm talking about, especially in the youth authority. It was ugly. So they were already, when the Bulldogs split, when the F14ers split, Sanjo was like, told you guys so. Like, it was kind of like a thing where only the strong survive. And there's been a lot of propaganda and things put out there that the Bulldogs dropped out of this or dropped out of that. And that's not the case. See, this is a very singular case where one group, besides, you know what, the Hoovers did it as well, letting the Crip go and just becoming criminals. And that happened around the same time, maybe 6-7 months after the Bulldogs did their thing. But whereas the Bulldogs decided, that 14ers decided to go their own route, what happened in that was, you know, the Norteños were like, fuck, bro. These guys right here are a threat. And they're a threat because they think like the Norteños, at least the ones did prior, the F14ers, because that's what they were. A lot of them had XIVs tattooed on them, Huelga birds, 14s, all that, because that's what they were. And imagine deciding just one day, none of that matters anymore to you. Nothing you've earned to that point. And it, you know, just because a few individuals decided to get together and say, you know, we could stand on our own. We don't need this group anymore. We don't need this backbone. We got our own. It's what they were able to do. And that changed the whole Norteño movement forever. So no, it will never be the same. As far as them being dropouts, no, they didn't drop out. They declared war upon another group. They decided, hey, we are going to be our own thing now. And so you can consider it dropping out if you want. I consider it just a group that defected, that went away. And it sucked, man. It sucked, man. I could tell you stories after stories about having to go at it with the Bulldogs, dudes that I did tattoos on, dudes that did tattoos on me, dudes that fucking I rocked with, busted spreads with, busted down with, was my cellies in the oil, was my cellies, you know, on the general population. Just I had a lot of respect for the Bulldogs. I knew about their history and their city and their town and their OG homeboys, and I was laced up. And I was very inquisitive to it because I was from the same area code, the 209 at that time. We were from right down the street, down the Highway 99, right? I was up north, Highway 99 North. Right? That's where I was. But yeah, you know, to answer the question why the North will never be the same without the F14ers, they will not. They will never be. And the Bulldog movement will never be the same without the Norteños. The F14ers will never be the same because it was one whole group that got fractured and split because a few individuals decided that they were being taken advantage of or that they were being disrespected. And you know what? Kudos to the Bulldogs, commends to the F14ers, man, because their vision continues to play out with, you know, new, I guess, gang members that are born every day today in the city of Fresno. That doesn't mean the imprint and the stamp of the Norte and the F14 won't forever be on the Bulldogs. They're always, you know, if they go to different states, different cities, people that don't know about the Bulldogs will automatically assume they're Norteños just because they still wear the colors red. They still, a lot of them, you know, look like a Norteño. So anyways, with that being said, that was a question that was asked to me why the Norte will never be the same. And it won't be. It won't be because, like I said, when you lose a group like that, it's like losing one of your craziest homeboys in the hood. And now you got to decide where you go from there. And especially when they're gunning for you. You know, the F14 movement was a very strong group. And they're going to forever have their stamp on the history books of the Norteño cause. But for those Norteños that strive now, that never had to strive amongst the Bulldogs when they were all one group, you'll never understand the loss that we took. Thumbs up or thumbs down. Heavy's going to be the head that wears the crown. I'm going to continue to strive, struggle, and strive for what I honestly and truly believe in. That's the betterment of all people. This video is sponsored by Vario Liquors in Turlock, California, the real 209. Make sure that you pull up to the Vario Liquors right there in Turlock and get you something cold to drink. Tell Lali I said what's up. Also, by Sticks and Stones Yard Service in Tucson, Arizona. If you need a smooth, cool estimate on some yard work out there in Tucson, Arizona, pull up to Sticks and Stones, man. Google them. Get you a rebate if you say Gunners Collective TV. This the gun. Bang, bang.